This is the UnShaw Podcast, the podcast about atheism, religion, and everything in between.
Welcome to the UnShaw Podcast. On the UnShaw Podcast, we delve deep into the realms of atheism and religion. I'm your host, Robert Shaw. In our last episodes, we explored perspectives from across the Atlantic, but today we're turning our focus closer to home. Stay tuned for an intriguing story. My guest today is a fellow Northerner hailing from the city of Manchester, England. Joining us is Helen Jefferson, and the theme of the podcast today is the Jehovah's Witness movement. And Helen can speak from many years' experience as an insider. And today we'll hopefully answer the question, are they merely a Christian denomination, or does a deeper, more intricate truth lie beneath the surface? Good morning, Helen. Thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Robert. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem at all. So, Jehovah's Witnessing, I understand as a child you were brought up within that particular faith. Tell us all about it.
Well, it was a bit complicated, really. It started with my brother being found dead in his bed. He had epilepsy. He was 19.
Well,
Obviously, this completely shattered my mother. We also found out around that time that my dad had bowel cancer. And 2 years later, he also passed away. During this time period of my brother dying, I think the Jehovah's Witnesses had a bit of a knack of reading the obituaries in the papers, and a lady reached out to my mum by knocking on the door, and because she knew her from school, she kind of had a way in there. My mum was like typically Roman Catholic, really. She fed her this pipe dream of being able to see her son again on a paradise earth, and everything she'd been taught by the sort of Catholic Church was not true. And of course, my mum being very vulnerable, she snapped this new ideology up. And then after that, the Jehovah's Witnesses were just like a flock at our address every Sunday. Every single one of us in the household was then getting a Bible study. And during that time, they realised that my dad actually was a disfellowshipped person. So they were saying we're not allowed to discuss the doctrine of the Jehovah's Witnesses in front of him unless he agrees to start returning to the meetings and gets reinstated. So they kind of told my dad that he wouldn't be resurrected after Armageddon unless he was reinstated, and we'd all get through to the paradise and we wouldn't have him in our family. So he started to study back again and got reinstated before he died. 5 months after that, my mum remarried. This person was a tyrant. I was constantly reporting abuse. It wasn't sexual abuse, but it was emotional and physical. And I had to endure that up until I managed to leave home at 18. I had an older sister. She was 5 years older than me, so she kind of already didn't really get brainwashed. There was always reservations with her, but she had to follow it, being in the same household. I did have another brother who's 15 years older than me. He was actually 2 years younger than our eldest brother who passed away. And he engaged with the Jehovah's Witnesses and became one as well. So he had a partner and a child as well. So they lived separately. We moved into this new man's house with his mother, moved areas, moved schools. We was told to drop all the rest of our family that weren't Jehovah's Witnesses and any friends that we'd made through life at school. And we had to start a new life in a different area, in a congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, in a new school, and declare ourselves openly as Jehovah's Witnesses. So it was a life-changing event, really, and a knock-on effect. My brother dying, and life just changed.
I'm presuming that the man that your mum remarried was a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah, he was a Jehovah's Witness. She was kind of warned not to jump into the marriage so quickly, but I think my mum just wanted to provide some level of security.
And she's obviously very vulnerable at this time as well.
Yeah.
As presumably you were, having gone through what you went through. And so you're living a life pretty much immersed in the Jehovah's Witness movement. And I mean, I'm not overly familiar with the religious beliefs, but it seems to me to have come out of the whole kind of movement in the 1800s, moving towards biblical literalism. The words of the Bible are inerrant and 100% true. And also there's a sense in Jehovah's Witnessing that the end of the world is nigh as well. They've made numerous predictions about the world ending, and they've suggested that we are living in end times. More of that later. And would I be right in that summary of the Jehovah's Witness movement?
Yeah, I mean, they have their own Bible, the New World Translation. It was actually edited by somebody that had linked to the occult, believe it or not. They don't really like to admit that. But yeah, they do have their own doctrine. They separate themselves from Christianity by not believing in a soul. For instance, they believe that they will live forever on earth if they survive Armageddon.
You talked about almost living this sheltered life, where I'm almost getting the sense that you weren't really permitted to mix with people from outside of the faith. And that must have involved you losing a lot of friends that you had previously. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, we lost literally everybody. We moved areas, like I say, and moved schools, and wasn't allowed to stay in touch with family members who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, and also friends you grew up with in school, neighbours, all of that. The people that witnessed the tragedies going on, all of those we were completely disconnected from and forced to make new friends.
Wow. And you can talk about this if you wish. I know it might be difficult for you, but are you willing to talk about the emotional abuse that you received from your stepfather?
Yeah, I am willing to talk about it. I mean, I've been out of the Jehovah's Witnesses for 14 years now, but it's not something I go often delving into. It kind of only comes out in snippets these days. Well, yeah, I'm more than happy to talk about it.
Okay, so what sort of abuse did you endure?
It was constant criticisms and put-downs, always parts of my character being dismantled and mocked by my stepdad. He used to do it out of sight of my mum because my mum was working very hard as a nurse in a hospital, trying to make ends meet. There was a lot of control. For instance, me and my sister were put into a little box room with bunk beds at first, but, we were sent to bed early and we weren't allowed to make any noise in the bedroom. It started like that. Eventually, my mum's husband's mum passed away and my sister moved into the other room. That was then a new rule that we weren't allowed into each other's bedroom. So we were constantly forced to be separate. Also, I was quite a strong, independent person up until being about 6 or 7 in my old school. But then in my new school, I was forced to tell everybody I was a Jehovah's Witness. And if there was any bullying or mockery, it was follow Jesus' example of turning the other cheek, never being able to stand up for myself. So I felt like a little bit of a target. But thankfully, I had my kind of sense of humour intact. I always felt out of place within the congregation. I was always trying to make friends, but I always felt a little bit rejected and treated differently. Just put it this way, my school attendance was always 100% because being at school was a safe place away from being around my stepdad. But because they were so hell-bent on control, and I don't know what the real sort of intention behind that or the agenda was, whether it was my mum's insecurity, knowing we were safe, and my stepdad's coercive control over her and ourselves contributed to it. But they started doing things like forcing me on report at school so that they could watch my every move. I wasn't allowed to play out with school children, mix after school, take part in any of what they classed as pagan sort of activities in school. Wasn't allowed in assemblies. So I was kind of ostracised from normal child's play at school. And then I'd go home to a list of chores and I'd be sent to bed early.
So to what extent did you subscribe to Jehovah's Witness beliefs at this stage, and both inwardly and outwardly, presumably outwardly, you're having to play the game, so to speak. Inwardly, did you believe the tenets of Jehovah's Witness faith?
I did, because me being so much younger and more impressionable, and also watching my dad go through the steps of being reinstated, it was just a normal thing to accept. For everybody in my family was doing it. I did miss people from my old school, but it was just the way it was. I didn't really challenge it or question it. I just followed it, and eventually became really ingrained. I got baptised at 14.
Mm-hmm.
I became what's called a regular pioneer. I also got taken out of school at 14. I didn't do any exams. A few of us were doing home education. What led up to me being taken out was a school friend reported to her mum that I constantly had marks on me, because I used to get belted every day with a physical belt if I went home from school and there was any marks on my report that I'd maybe interrupted in class, or I'd been caught chewing gum, all the daft typical things.
Yeah.
But I'd get hit with a belt depending on how many times I'd been pulled in school. I was a very good drama student, so during that time period also, I was told that I had to attend this particular assembly day, and they announced that they were sending me on a scholarship to drama school for the last 2 years of school. Of course, that combined with the reports with social services of potential abuse going on, that was just the nail in the coffin of being taken out of school and forced to be home educated. Where I was told education didn't really matter, I didn't have to take exams, I could pursue my career as what they call a regular pioneer, which is somebody who knocks on doors 60 hours a month at first, and then you lead up to 90 hours a month. So I spent a good few years, probably about 4 years, knocking on doors, preaching, and cleaning jobs and things like that to support myself.
I remember once seeing an interview with an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and they were talking about, I think, their mother in this interview, and they said that in 30 years of doing this sort of thing, of going from door to door, they'd not managed to bring one single person into the fold. Was that your experience going from door to door?
Yeah, I never managed to get someone into a Bible study where they'd commit to getting baptised with the church. Did witness so many other people having studied. This was a regular thing. People would be sort of welcomed into the congregation. They'd have Bible studies. I think a couple of them did eventually join, but in general, it wasn't like some kind of mass conversion going on.
What was the typical response on the doorstep?
So we'd usually have a briefcase full of books that would have the answers for every kind of objection. I was put through what was called a pioneer school for 2 weeks. So we were told we were like the elite of the Jehovah's Witnesses because we were regular pioneers doing 90 hours a month. That was classed as a privilege. So it would literally be a case of, hi, good morning. We'd mention negatives in the world and then sort of ask people, wouldn't they like to see the world a better place? And then it'd immediately be either recommending the Watchtower and Awake, or we'd show them some verses of Bible passage, thinking that we would be able to, drag somebody into a better lifestyle and coming along to the meetings or accept a Bible study. And bearing in mind, fully believing that you had the truth and that the world was going to end. It was kind of like a life-saving mission. We were taught that we would be blood guilty if we didn't impart that knowledge to other people. Then that was our obligation as a faithful, loyal servant of Jehovah.
What was the typical response on the doorstep when you were going from door to door?
Rarely had the door slammed in my face. I was quite lucky that I was quite easy on the eye, I suppose. Even though I was innocent and sweet, I was always quite able to engage decently with people. I think the only couple of times where I did get the door actually slammed in my face was a guy ranting that would dare to knock on his door, and me having the gumption that I had. I was like, I'm not having that. So I went back and I knocked on his door and I was like, you do realise you didn't have to be so rude. We can actually put you down as a do not call so we don't bother you again. And he was kind of like, oh, okay. Yeah, fine. Fair enough. When I look back at all those situations though, I actually had a funny experience where 2 Latter-day Saints knocked on my door a few years back. I invited them in and they weren't allowed to come in unless there was a male chaperone. So we booked an appointment later in the week and I made them this big meal. There were 2 missionaries. One was from Ecuador. Can't quite remember where the others, young lads. And they were there with their Book of Mormon, showing me all the pages and talking to me about the prophets. And I did it as a bit of an experiment to see what it was like to be on the other side of what I would class as a religious cult. And I just thought, how naive and cringeworthy is it that presenting a book or a piece of paper is something that is going to make somebody sign their life away to a lifestyle and a belief system? It was like, oh my God, I can't believe how brainwashed I was.
Yeah. And I did remember watching a documentary a couple of years ago about 2 Mormon missionaries. As you know, particularly the males, I think it is, have to go off for a year or 2 and do missionary work abroad. And they just seemed to have a completely disheartening existence, really. You know, they weren't successful at all in signing people up. And it just seemed a huge waste of everyone's time.
Well, for them, they had an incentive. They usually get offered a free education at the end of the missionary service.
Right.
You're not as well thought of in the congregation if you pursue what they class as worldly interests. Education teaches you to think independently, which the Jehovah's Witness narrative is that Satan, being the serpent to tempt Eve, his first sin was independent thinking. So this is why they like to have the collective reinforcement of following the rules, because if you think outside of the box and challenge the beliefs, you're also committing that same sin of independent thinking, which, if you look at it from an objective point of view, is pretty ludicrous, not being allowed the basic human right to think for yourself.
And you've talked about informing people that the end of the world is nigh. And I know that the movement made various predictions that we were living in end times, to the extent that they would give dates in the near future. Was that something that you were doing when you were doing this as well?
I was of the generations where they were giving actual dates. For my experience, it was more Armageddon's just around the corner. We don't know the day or time of which it will happen, but we are in the last days and things could just take a turn at any time. So it's really important that you are resolute in your faith. You have such a hierarchy that there is no getting away with things. There's no alternative. They demonise other religious beliefs anyway, so that stops you from wanting to seek a different belief system because they've already pulled every other belief system to shreds. They make the people out that don't worship Jehovah incapable of love. Therefore, if you step out into that worldly environment, everything's just going to be damaging to you. You'll end up on drugs, or you'll be promiscuous, or you'll end up with an infectious disease, something like that. You know, some chaotic type of thinking, calamitous downfall, demise will happen to you if you leave. There's all of that, but then you've got your parents to answer to as a child. You then have the elders and congregation constantly watching what's going on. You have your peers that are indoctrinated to be your friends, but if you do anything that's out of line from the rules and regulations of the watchtower, then they are told that they have to force you to confess, or they will go and grass on you, and you will then, if you're baptized, be disfellowshipped for not confessing if they get to the elders before you. Then the elders have like a circuit overseer. You then have the governing body of the Jehovah's Witnesses in the Bethel. But then on top of those, all those people you can potentially let down, you then have the angels watching you. You've got Jesus watching you. You've got Jehovah. And if you're not pleasing them, the devil's going to be laughing and clapping his hands because you're pleasing him. So it's just so psychologically overwhelming and abusive that no matter where you want to go, everybody is either judging you or waiting to pull you into some kind of bad lifestyle.
You've talked about the belief that the end of the world is nigh and so on. What I understand, and from what you told me about it being resurrection rather than going to heaven, and I've also heard the figure of 144,000 being bandied around as well. And what did the afterlife look like to you as a Jehovah's Witness, as well as it kind of happening quite soon? What was going to happen?
So there would be mass persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. So they kind of told us we could be tortured, imprisoned, killed, separated from our families. And then our faith would be tested. So if we didn't stay faithful, so let's say we denied we were Jehovah's Witnesses out of fear for our lives, then that's the nail in your coffin. You have been unfaithful to Jehovah, so you won't get through Armageddon. If you were lucky enough through this persecution time to actually get through Armageddon, that would be the whole world being completely destroyed by Jehovah and his angels, fire and brimstone, earth swallowing people up, buildings collapsing, watching people die in front of you, this apocalyptic kind of reset. And then, Jehovah's Witnesses that survived that came out of hiding would then have to clean that world up and over 1,000 years' time, turn it into a paradise. Now, the 144,000 are a group of people that self-profess to be going to heaven. There's no evidence of this. No one can really challenge them. They believe that the minute they die, at whatever point, they will immediately be converted into an angelic being. God gives them that gift of immortality, whereas angels are still mortal, so they can be destroyed by God at any time. And this 144,000 will rule over the earth during this 1,000 years of people attaining perfection and people being resurrected. We're talking beliefs like serial killers, paedophiles, people like Hitler would be resurrected back to paradise on earth, and within that 1,000 years being given an opportunity to repent, submit themselves to will of Jehovah.
And that's quite something to get your head around if you're a teenage girl in Manchester, isn't it? And also, my understanding is that birthdays are considered a pagan celebration. So you didn't have the opportunity to have birthday parties as a child either.
Yeah, like I say, up until about 6 or 7, life was relatively normal. Well, it was normal. Christmases, birthdays, family, just all the general kind of stuff in the 80s for me. It was just normal. But then all of a sudden that stopped and we moved away. So yeah, we didn't celebrate birthdays, Easter, Christmas, Halloween, Pancake Day, anything really. The only thing they would do is like weddings, engagements, or the memorial of Jesus' death, or people getting baptized.
So it must have been difficult attending school where you no doubt had this suspicion about Easter and Christmas and so on, and everything around you was all about looking forward to Christmas when you're a child, isn't it? So that must have been difficult for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a change, but I accepted it quite easy because I was quite young and impressionable, and so much for me had changed.
Yeah.
But it's one of those, they're so good at the way they subtly manipulate you into obedience and allowing yourself to become coerced and indoctrinated. You kind of feel almost narcissistic, grandiose way that you're better than people. So whilst you're standing up and saying, well, I'm not doing birthdays or Christmas because I'm a Jehovah's Witness, it's kind of encouraged that you're standing up for what's right. So you do develop this kind of us and them attitude anyway.
And everyone else is like a heathen.
Oh, you feel sorry for them because they just don't have a clue what they're doing. So condescending.
Yeah, wow. Another question to ask, and again, this might be quite sensitive. The Jehovah's Witnesses, like the Catholic Church, have a reputation for covering up instances of abuse within their communities. Was that something that you ever witnessed?
The fact that my own cries for help because of a stepdad that was really tyrannical and persecutory, to be honest, always got sort of pushed down as in, he's the head of the household. And it was constantly told to me by him that what goes on in these four walls, stay in these four walls, you're a big mouth, no one's going to listen to you. So that was just sort of physical, emotional abuse, especially home educated at 14. He was mainly responsible for facilitating that. So I felt like I was in the lion's den every day with him. As far as sexual abuse is concerned, I wasn't abused by any Jehovah's Witnesses that I can turn around and say did this, that and the other to me. But I will add to that during the time that my mum was studying, she did go through a bit of an alcoholism stage, obviously through the grief of losing her son, our oldest brother. We were placed with various individuals and there are blurred memories of things happening to me at Jehovah's Witness parties by a couple of lads that were older than me. Now, they've actually been convicted and charged a few years back because it wasn't just me that was happening to.
Right.
That all came out in the future. I didn't get involved in that because it was too blurry for me to be able to pinpoint, but the body never lies. I used to see this picture with myself dressed as Little Bo Peep at a party, and there was a lad sat on the sofa behind me, and I always used to recoil in horror when I saw that picture. That was one of the people that was convicted, and I remember a few incidents going on. I would say as a child I was sexualised, and I'm not sure who, apart from those two lads, who else were perpetrators.
Going to see one of the elders about your stepfather's behaviour would have been completely out of the question.
Yeah, I did talk to other Jehovah's Witnesses that were older than me, and some of them were very supportive and really loving and protective over me, but he would just outright deny it. He was a Jekyll and Hyde character, and he's very clever. He used to do it only when nobody was there to see it.
We're now going to get into the topic of your deconversion. Was it a sudden thing, or did it happen gradually? Are you able to pinpoint a specific time during your life where you thought, hang on a minute, this is all nonsense?
Yeah, I mean, it was when I was 30, but before that, I'd kind of got a little bit too fed up with the pressure. I ended up marrying outside of the Jehovah's Witnesses when I was very young. That was a complicated situation. That was somebody who, was also going through trauma, and it was a rushed thing. So it was a big mistake that when I was 21, wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, but not something I want to go into. We quickly got divorced after a few years, and that part of my life's past. Just before that, I started to become very disillusioned in my relationships that I was having within the Jehovah's Witnesses. People that were marrying into the family, their attitudes and behaviours were pretty disgusting. I just never felt supported by my own family. I always used to feel attacked and criticised and accused of being entitled or manipulative. And I just never felt safe. And at this point, I was ready to just leave. My friend also had died after a motorcycle accident and wasn't allowed a blood transfusion. And he died. His body went into shock. That was another shock to myself. It was very traumatic to lose that person.
And that stems from the Jehovah's Witness belief that your soul is in your blood or something similar, therefore.
No, they take it from the scriptures, that the first part of the Bible, the Torah side of it, of pouring the blood to the ground. An animal that you would pour the blood because that's the life source. I think it's about the individual DNA. Therefore, you're not supposed to ingest blood. But I wasn't intending on leaving, but I just found myself increasingly out of favour with everybody. I just couldn't do right for doing wrong. And I'd always been an entertainer and a singer, and I'd always loved the singing. So I was going to karaoke places because it wasn't really allowed or encouraged in the witnesses, but I just had this deep side of me where I just loved my music and my singing. But there were a couple of other things that I'd spoken to other friends, like at the gym, who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, that were lovely people, but used to challenge some of the things I believed, and I didn't seem to be able to find answers anymore, and I was always good at giving an answer. Some conversations really troubled me. So I started digging around from sources that I felt were biased, and I realised a lot of the roots of the Jehovah's Witnesses were based in occult teachings and Luciferian teachings, and me actually being a goody two-shoes and believing I was worshipping God. When I realised the strong connection with what would be satanic belief systems, it really frightened me. I had to say something. I challenged the elders. I asked them about other teachings. I challenged them about other connections and teachings as to the doctrine and where it originated from. And they said, yes, we did have connections with that, but Charles Taze Russell, was just learning from Jehovah, and he got things wrong, but they also got a lot of things right, and we've changed so much from that sort of background. And don't ask any more questions. If you do want to ask any questions, write to Bethel.
What's Bethel?
Bethel is like the headquarters of the Watchtower Society.
Okay. So they've encouraged you to write to the headquarters of the Jehovah's Witnesses with any further questions. And what happened then?
I was called into what's called a judicial committee meeting because they'd been digging around on me for quite a while, but they couldn't find anything to disfellowship me for other than concerns that were expressed by these newcomers, into our family, people that were dating my nephews, for instance, and friends were all gossiping with each other saying, Helen's leaving the beliefs, she's questioning, she's talking about apostate things, we're worried, let's report her to the elders. So they pulled me into this judicial committee meeting, but by that time, I'd completely lost all faith in them, the organisation. I felt like I'd been released from mental captivity. They said, look, give it a couple of weeks, come back to the meetings, stop talking about what you're talking about, and we'll just forget the whole situation, but you must stop talking about the things you're talking about. But I didn't go back. These people were people that I'd known from being maybe 7 years old. You know, these people were classed as, you know, brothers and sisters and parents in a way, you know, people that loved me, looked out for me. You know, there were a couple of the elders there that I weren't that close to, but there were a couple of them that used the fact that we had this connection and attachment to each other to kind of sway me and pulling on my heartstrings and the sentimentality. It was a really difficult thing to go through, but I knew that I was leaving and I knew I had to walk away. And I knew at some point, unless I could avoid it, I would be excommunicated and I would lose my family and my friends would stop talking to me. But because of my own integrity to what was right and wrong, I just thought, so be it.
Okay. And presumably after this meeting, you never went back?
Never. The only time I went back was when my stepdad finally passed away to his funeral. And then the only next time I saw all of those was at my mother's funeral.
Yeah. So were you ostracised subsequently by people?
It was announced without me being told of when it would be announced that I was no longer a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So that's, you know, their way, because they have to be careful what they say, you know, to save themselves money from being sued. I wasn't aware that announcement was being made at that time. It was because all I thought was, the family must think I'm so disrespectful that I haven't given them a warning that, you know, this humiliating announcement is going to be made.
Yeah. Did people refuse to speak to you and have any further contact with you?
Yeah, that was the end of that.
What, so no one who was part of the congregation spoke to you again?
No, they didn't. I had one person who, funnily enough, has left, who went through the home education side with me. He has recently realised everything he's ever stood for and believed in is not true. His parents were very close to us, so that's been difficult for him. But yeah, I'd say 99% of the people just were no longer allowed to speak with me because of the nature of disfellowshipping. I was disfellowshipped for apostasy, which is the worst thing you can be disfellowshipped for.
And this includes family members as well?
Yeah.
And you're still in that situation now where you've got family members who, for want of a better phrase, you're dead to them.
Yeah, so when my stepdad got ill, they classed things as business is business. So I did do things and see my mum and stepdad. He kind of chilled out a little bit more when he got ill because he was vulnerable then, wasn't he?
Yeah.
And then my mum also needed support when she was poorly after he died, so we would have a form of a relationship. But unfortunately, because of all the things that had happened, me and my mum wasn't that close. My sister was a lot closer with my mum because she had children, so you got the grandparent aspect. There was a lot of lost time, really, being able to get that relationship truly back to how it should have been with my mum. She was a hard worker and she was a good person.
Sure, and wider family members, though, are you still out of contact with them?
Yeah. I have that older brother. He's got the 6 kids, 4 of them adults and married with their own kids. They don't bother with me.
Right.
Yeah, on my Facebook, 3 of them. I've sent a couple of messages just to try and sort of reach out, say hi.
Yeah.
Never get anything back. Don't get a reply. I don't even know my brother's phone number. There were times where he did say he wanted to meet up and have a brew, a coffee and that, but I kind of think maybe his wife doesn't like the idea of that, even though we were very, very close. You know, I think she's gone throwing herself headfirst into the belief system because they were all very wishy-washy with their attending meetings. They wouldn't go knocking on doors. You know, they'd all do their own thing, give the minimum input, which is quite infuriating because for them to be given minimum input and then have this kind of righteous attitude all of a sudden is annoying, when it was probably myself out of all of the family that threw myself headfirst into that organisation and did the most.
Yeah, sure. So you've left left the Jehovah's Witness movement, and you've talked about ostracization or the disassociation that went on after that. And yeah, clearly that's going to be traumatic for anybody. And you've since moved into counselling, is that right?
Yeah, I worked in mental health for 12 years as a support worker on all the acute wards for the NHS, which is a great education, met some fantastic people. I decided I didn't want to do the mental health nursing. I wanted to not facilitate giving people medication. I wanted to more delve into the root causes. So I became a psychotherapist. I qualified in 2019. I've worked for a couple of corporate EAP firms. I am now in private practice and also freelancing.
Do you counsel people who have had a similar experience to your own?
Yeah, I originally kind of thought I'd go into that field to help ex-Jehovah's Witnesses that didn't have any support. But unfortunately, I do have this feeling that some of them spend that much time dwelling on what's happened to them, dwelling on the post-traumatic stress, which is part of the healing process. I don't find that any good. That's my past now, and there's no point revisiting. I know what the organisation is. I know what it's about. And I'm more focused on people who don't have one foot in, one foot out. I've had a few experiences of being burnt and supporting people that have left because either they've been kicked out for, committing a sin, or they've had doubts, or they've wanted relationships with people that are not Jehovah's Witnesses. So it served the purpose then to befriend non-Jehovah's Witnesses or people who've been excommunicated. But then they have an attack of conscience or, going out into that new world, into an unfamiliar zone, creates separation anxieties, the congregation and the friends and family network. So a lot of these reasons when people step out of it, they do end up sort of getting family guilt trip them into going back, and they do go back. Then you get those people just dropping you as if you didn't exist. So I try to keep away from people that are not fully out of it because it doesn't help me. I don't need to have friends that will be disloyal to me.
So what are the consequences? You've presumably spoken to people who have deconverted from what you're suggesting is quite a high control religious organisation. In addition to the feelings of isolation, what other mental health problems is it possible to identify that these people go through?
Well, because you live with cognitive dissonance, putting your authentic self behind and modelling yourself on the expectations of who and what you should stand for. The formal diagnosis for the symptoms that people endure after this experience would be likened to either borderline personality disorder or complex post-traumatic stress, which is the field that I support with the most.
And that's not just with people who experience these issues due to religious deconversion, but also for other reasons as well?
Yes, systematic abuse over a sustained period of time.
So tell us about your experience with regards to your mental health and deconversing.
Well, like I say, I felt a lot of the time unaccepted, never loved unconditionally. I would say it formed attachment and abandonment issues into me, not only with, losing two top male figures in my life and, only having my oldest brother to go to for support, but we were all kind of controlled in this environment, I suppose. I have a sister who's older as well, and she's amazing. She's not a Jehovah's Witness. She's happily married. I would say I definitely did suffer the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress because of the stress hormones and the cortisol release from all the anxiety and the hypervigilance, walking on eggshells, constant fear of rejection and judgment. And that led me to being a codependent and submissive person because of the oppressive nature of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Then going from one toxic relationship to another, suffering with domestic abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. I very quickly, intermittently went through substance misuse stages for alcohol dependency. Wasn't ever the drug kind. I was never into drugs, but alcohol's my sort of go-to place. And, I broke my dignity various times, ended up in dangerous situations, was used when I was out of capacity. Plus, being the entertainer side of myself, I was in a lot of pubs and venues and there was a lot of alcohol around me anyway, so that was an easy thing to do. But I would go through meltdown after meltdown of going into a relationship that was just not good for me, always settling for less than what I deserved because I didn't have that belief in myself, and then I would suffer that abandonment, rejection, infidelity all over again, which sent me crashing back down. It was like a hell loop until I started training in my psychotherapy, and I understood all of a sudden that there was something out there called complex post-traumatic stress, and I started to really open my eyes as to all these symptoms and things that I was suffering with and unable to get power over. I felt very vulnerable and weak, and that I would never be normal. I can only liken it to walking around with a demon in my chest, because I'd suffer splits in personality when I'd be under the influence of alcohol. I'd be normal 1 minute and then I'd black out, and people would tell me, you know, I'd say the vilest of things, the hurtfulest of things. I would have a real horrible sort of way of conveying all those suppressed emotions.
Yeah.
Abuse from my stepdad.
Yeah.
I turned into him, and I would project and transfer that onto other people. So yeah, as horrible as that situation was, I think that makes me have a lot of faith in the therapeutic process now, because I don't have those problems now, thank goodness.
Okay.
I think those complex PTSD symptoms have been well addressed and mostly healed from.
Yeah.
I also can recognise any potential triggers, and I have to be very protective of myself in that way and boundary manage. And I have full faith that with that right understanding from a therapeutic input from the right therapist, people that are going through that hell loop themselves, they can get power over it, and they can lead a successful life, and they can reach the full potential.
If we have any listeners perhaps who are in the early stages of this process and they're experiencing the issues that you've described, what would be your best advice to them as a mental health professional?
I would say seek out a therapist that understands and works with things like borderline personality and complex post-traumatic stress. I would also say if they're relying heavily on psychiatric drugs, get the doctors to re-refer them for an assessment for things like CPTSD or BPD, because a lot of people are prescribed anxiety and depression medication, and the narrative for that usually is nothing's working for them. They're still not healed. They still crash. They still have the same problems over and over, that there's still something missing in them that hasn't healed. I think correct diagnosis is important. And those diagnoses don't come usually hand in hand with a prescriptive drug recommendation. They do come with a more sort of niche trauma therapy support.
So finding a therapist who perhaps has some experience of dealing with a similar situation would be your advice, as opposed to perhaps what unfortunately is the NHS's approach to dealing with mental health, and that's to put you on medication.
The biomedical model. I was quite triggered the other day. I was pretty much infuriated because the rumour going around was that the organisation has loosened some of its rules, i.e. men are now allowed to have beards, women are allowed to wear trousers at the meetings, and tattoos don't need to be covered up, and that the slackening the rules on the ostracism of disfellowship people. Actually, it's not the case. It's complete, again, let's drip feed the Jehovah's Witnesses into believing the loosening, the kind of policies and procedures to empower people in order to encourage repentant wrongdoers to come back. They're still only allowed to speak to people at the Kingdom Hall. They can't resume association with the family members. And my biggest indignation against them is, you know, they've deprived myself and my sister of that support network of a family. I feel it's severe deprivation of human rights. I know that there are court cases and lawsuits all over the world against the organisation for sexual abuse, but I think the emotional abuse scars run very deep and are carried around a lot more long term. I'm not discounting sexual abuse, but when it's emotional and spiritual abuse as well, you know, it's narcissistic abuse ultimately, and that also creates complex PTSD.
So, thank you, Helen. Thank you for giving me your time this morning on the UnShaw Podcast. I'm sure listeners will find it informative and thought-provoking. Thank you again.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and good luck going forward, and I'm sure we will stay in touch.
Thank you again for tuning in on this Sunday to the UnShaw Podcast. As we draw the curtains on today's episode, I want to highlight something significant. March the 24th is recognised by the United Nations General Assembly as International Truth Day. It's a reminder of the importance of seeking and acknowledging truth in our lives. I'm truly heartened by the feedback from listeners who express how they've gained insights from our discussions. On this International Truth Day, I hope my podcast serves as a beacon, enabling listeners to navigate the complexities of reality with a clearer understanding. Throughout today's episode, we've explored the intricate dynamics of the Jehovah's Witness movement. Remember, one person's perspective does not equate to the ultimate truth. That's why I extend an open invitation to any Jehovah's Witness who wishes to share their side of the story on this platform. As we conclude, I want to express gratitude for your continued support. Keep questioning, keep seeking, and until next time, stay curious. Goodbye. Remember, truth is a journey we embark on together.